You are tuned to the Indraprastha channel of Akashvani. Today is International Jazz Day, and we are bringing to you a talk on the world of jazz by D. Andrews, who recently retired from Akashvani a few years ago. Popularly known as Vintage Andrew, Andrew shares his brush with the jazz music.
My listening to jazz music for the first time goes back to the year 1986 when I was working for an ad agency. We were going to show a promotional film of one of our clients at the Taj Palace Hotel. The preparations were really good over there and a lot of guests were present in the hall. While we were setting up our equipments to screen the film, there was a beautiful soft music on the trumpet being played in the hall. I was really fascinated by the band group which was playing the music live. In fact, this was my first encounter with jazz music. I asked my boss about this music and he told me it was jazz. That was my first encounter with this genre of music. I had grown up listening to pop music of yesteryears during my younger days, and that was the first and the last time I heard this music, until the year 1990 when I joined All India Radio as an announcer. In the same year, it was on a Thursday in the primary channel called Rajdhani Channel, when I had to play a slot exclusively for jazz music titled All That Jazz. My joy knew no bounds. I had a wonderful time during that 1 hour of music. After that, my date with jazz music continued for 32 years. I used to play jazz music even on FM Rainbow titled Time for Jazz. Jazz is a music genre that originated in the African American communities of New Orleans, Louisiana, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with its roots in blues and ragtime. Since the 1920s jazz age, it has been recognized as a major form of musical expression in traditional and popular music. Jazz is characterized by swing and blue notes, complex chords, call and response vocals, polyrhythms, and improvisations. Jazz has roots in European harmony and African rhythmic rituals. The word jazz originated in slang around 1912 on the West Coast. The meaning varied, but the word initially did not refer to music jazz, and that came to jazz music in Chicago around 1915. Typical jazz instruments which are in use today are double bass, drums, guitar, typically electric guitar, and then piano, saxophone, trumpet, clarinet, trombone, tuba, vibraphone, Hammond organ, and harmonica or the mouth organ. To tell you something about what jazz in fact is not and never has been an entirely composed, predetermined music, nor it is an entirely extemporized one. For almost all of its history, it has employed both creative approaches in varying degrees and endless permutations. And yet, despite these diverse terminological confusion, jazz seems to be an instantly recognized and distinguished as something separate from all other forms of musical expression. To add to the confusion, there often have been seemingly unbridgeable perpetual differences between the producers of jazz, performers, composers and arrangers, and its audiences. Most early classical composers who became smitten with jazz were drawn to its sounds and timbres, the unusual effects and inflections of jazz playing, that is, brass notes, glissandros, scoops, bends, and stringless ensembles, and its syncopations, completely ignoring or at least underappreciating that jazz musicians make on the instruments, the way they attack, inflect, release, embellish, and color notes characterize jazz playing to such an extent that if a classical piece were played by jazz musicians in their idiomatic phrasings, it would in all likelihood be called jazz. Nonetheless, one important aspect of jazz clearly does distinguish it from other traditional music areas, especially from classical music. The jazz performer is primarily or wholly a creator, improvising composer, his own composer as it were, whereas in classical music, the performer typically expresses and interprets someone else's composition. The elements that jazz make distinctive derive primarily from West African musical sources, as taken to the North American continent by slaves, who partially preserved them against all odds in the plantation culture of the American South. These elements are not precisely identifiable because they were not documented, at least not until the mid to late 19th century, and then only sparsely. Furthermore, black slaves came from diverse West African tribal cultures with distinct musical traditions. Thus, a great variety of black musical sensibilities were assembled on American soil. The music that eventually became jazz evolved out of a wide-ranging, gradually assimilated mixture of black and white folk musics and popular styles, with roots in both West Africa and Europe. It is only a slight oversimplification to assert that the rhythmic and structural elements of jazz, as well as some aspects of its customary instrumentation, example banjo, guitar and percussions, derive primarily from West African traditions, whereas the European influences can be heard not only in the harmonic language of jazz, but in its use of such conventional instruments as trumpet, trombone, saxophone, string bass and piano. Some of the great artists of jazz music are John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Louis Armstrong, Charles Mingus, Charlie Parker, Ella Fitzgerald, Thelonious Monk, Billie Holiday, Chet Baker, Duke Ellington, Herbie Hancock, Nat King Cole, Django Reinhardt, Art Tatum, Art Blakey, Bill Evans, Sonny Rollins, Mary Lou Williams, Keith Jarrett, Andy Edwards, Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Dizzy Gillespie, Pat Metheny, Kurt Elling, Wynton Marsalis, Ornette Coleman, Jamie Cullum, Wes Montgomery, Neha Simone, Frank Sinatra, Count Basie, and Stan Getz, to name a few. Of course, all these artists I was able to hear when I did that one-hour show for the first time in the year 1990 on the primary channel, that is Rajdhani channel. And that's why, I'm really able to, I know how good these people are. And the most recent jazz artists are Brad Mehldau, Esperanza Planling, Robert Glasper, Kamasi Washington, Joshua Redman, Moses Boyd, Yusuf Days, Nora Jones, Vijay Iyer, Kurt Rosenwinkel, Brian Curbertson, Julian Laig, Patty Austin, Keith Jarrett, Rick Braun, David Benoit, Bonnie James, Paul Hardcastle, Karen Souza, Candy Dudler, and Walter Beasley, to name a few. And some of the Indian jazz musicians are Keshav Sate, Ramesh Shotham, Baluji Srivastav, Suma Sudhindra, and the queen of Indian pop and jazz is, of course, the great and legendary Usha Uttup. Two forms of music began to flourish in the late 19th century, that is blues, more as an informal music purveyed mostly by itinerant singers, guitarists and pianists, and ragtime becoming America's popular entertainment and dance music. Ragtime substantially differs from jazz in that it was 1. A thorough composed, fully notated music intended to be played in more or less the same manner each time, much like classical music, and a music written initially and essentially for the piano. Jazz, by contrast, became a primarily instrumental music, often not notated, and partially or wholly improvised. Ragtime had its own march, derived 4-part form, divided into successive 16-bar sections, whereas jazz, once weaned away from ragtime form, tuned either to the 12-bar or occasionally 8-bar blues or the 32-bar song forms. What the two music genres had in common was they syncopated melodies and themes placed over a constant, regular accompaniment. Well, guys, I just wanted to tell you something about this wonderful talk on jazz, and just continue to listen. I'm telling you, you'll become a fan, you'll become a crazy fan of jazz music. And that is what I have become right now.
You just heard a talk on the world of jazz music in connection with International Jazz Day, presented by D. Andrew. This talk came to you from the studios of Indraprastha channel of Akashvani. Please stay tuned in for our next program.